All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. My name is Christy Walkuski. I am the director of the Brain Center here at BW, and Julie Robinson is also here. You'll get to hear a bit more from her at the end of tonight's event. We have a very full program with lots of really important content to cover and 3 fantastic presenters. So I'm going to keep my introductory remarks very brief tonight. This is the 3rd session in our summer series. You can find recordings of both of our previous sessions hosted by Dr. James Garrison and Dr. Tom Sutton at our event page, which is bw.edu/civic. They've also shared a number of recommended resources for future learning and future action, so please check those out. Just a bit of virtual event etiquette reminders. Everyone is going to remain muted tonight until the end when we have some time for Q&A, but you can feel free to submit any questions that you have along the way in the chat box. This session is being recorded, so I want to make sure everyone's aware of that, and it will be shared via our Brain Center YouTube channel as well as on that event page. With 3 presenters and a number of videos, we ask for your patience as we swap back and forth between presenters and videos throughout the session. So just have some patience with us and our technology, even though we've practiced and we'll be good. So no worries. Just as a part of this series, we recognize that these conversations alone are not the solution, but we hope that they can serve as a foundation for our BW community as we move forward together towards efforts of racial equity here on campus and in our wider community. We do want to acknowledge that this series is by no means comprehensive, either in academic perspective or in lived experience. So if you have a story to tell or a topic you'd like to explore through this series, we hope that you'll reach out to us. We are already developing our fall series, and so would love to have folks included if anybody has ideas. Finally, this event is rooted in the expectations established by BW's community standards of conduct. So we expect this to be a space where we can engage together empathetically, respectfully, and thoughtfully. Our 3 speakers, a really brief intro to them. Dr. Lisa Green is a professor in the Department of Psychology here at BW. She's also a licensed clinical psychologist. Her specialization is in working with children, adolescents, and families. She's chaired the Service Learning Advisory Council. She's advised multiple alternative break trips, including the most recent civil rights trip to Atlanta, Montgomery, and Selma this past year. She's earned her PhD in clinical child psychology from Ohio State. Amy Larocca is a certified speech language pathologist and clinical assistant professor in the Communication Sciences and Disorders Department here at BW. She teaches both undergraduate and graduate level courses, and she's a member of our Service Learning Advisory team and has collaborated with partners in Zambia through their Speech Language Pathology Program. Finally, we have a wonderful community guest tonight. Michelle Shiver is a graduate of Hampton University with a degree in Marketing and Communications. She currently works for the Social Security Administration as the VP for Black Affairs Advisory Council. And growing up as a Black woman, now raising a son, she's very passionate on issues surrounding racism and social injustice. So welcome to all 3 of you. Michelle, thanks for joining the BW community tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to all of you. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for attending tonight. Thanks to Christy and Julie for the opportunity to share this information. And thanks especially to my colleagues and friends, Amy and Michelle, for your excellent collaboration on all of this. We're really excited to share this information tonight with all of you. So when we're thinking about how do children develop prejudice, one of the first things that's a prerequisite is for them to be able to identify differences and categorize. And so you can see here an outline of the milestones for children in terms of recognizing differences and understanding race. And so as early as 3 to 6 months through dishabituation and preferential looking studies, we find that children can see differences in skin color. This, though, is dependent in part on their exposure and experiences. So children in mixed race families don't show this same perception of differences yet. But you can see in the first couple years, they can recognize differences. They don't assign any value to race at that point. About the age of 3, they begin to make social categorizations. But the typical first one is gender, so I'm a boy, I'm a girl. By 4 to 5, though, they are categorizing based on race and showing preferences and so forth. Interestingly, by 8 to 10 years, we do see that children find that it's inappropriate to express racial biases, but their implicit biases are already present at this time. So we're going to be talking about 5 different theories of understanding prejudice development, but it's really important for you to keep in mind that these theories are not mutually exclusive, and not only that, that concepts from multiple different theories may be at play. So the first theory that we're going to take a look at is socialization. And so how are children socialized? How do they learn to understand the rules in society as with respect to prejudice? And prejudice is taught to children by their parents, by their peers, by the media, community culture, and it can happen in different ways. So through direct instruction, telling children what to think and believe, through observation or modeling, through rewards and punishment. We find that parents typically are similar in their attitudes, and they determine the kinds of exposure that children get. Media tends to have a negative tone and present biased reporting and so forth.
Lisa, we can't hear you. I'm not sure if you're muted.
Thank you very much. I'm next. I'm sorry, you guys. So, talking about socialization, the earliest opportunities for children to socialize is typically through play. And depending on what they're playing with and who they're playing with, it really does help to determine if they and when they start to develop prejudice. So taking a look at the children in your lives, whether it's your own children, whether it's family members, it's if you're a teacher in a clinic, wherever you are, looking at what are they playing with and really looking at your manipulatives. So are they the toys on here like what I grew up with, which did not have a diverse representation within them at all, or making sure that what they are playing with does represent the world in which they are living, that they're able to be exposed to various makeups of populations and groups within the objects that they're playing. Another aspect are the books that we have, and what are they reading or the movies that they're seeing? Is the message within the books that they're reading, is it a positive message or is it biased? We all grew up with Dr. Seuss, probably. I certainly did. But I've come to find out that there are some of his books that have very biased and can be considered racial messages within, especially this, If I Ran the Zoo, animalizes different cultures and groups of people. So really being mindful of what exposure your children are having through the toys and the influences they have. The other aspect within play is how can we help to influence their perceptions, and understanding how play develops is key to this process of then how can we teach them these more unbiased thoughts. So understanding that play first develops as mimicking. So infants mimic the behaviors that they see around them. And then as children grow, they start to have parallel play, where they'll play next to a peer or they'll play next to another person, but not really interact with them. Then they'll develop the skills to be able to interact and have that interactive play. And eventually they'll start to have imaginative play, where they'll act out different scenarios. This is when it's really key to be able to observe how are your children or the children that you're around, how are they interacting with their peers? What types of stories are they out? There's absolutely power dynamics in the way that children interact with each other and the stories in which they act out. is the same type of character, the villain all the time? Is Black Panther always in jail and the villain, and Captain America always saving him? Or are they varying things up? So they're going to learn from their peers. But this is a great way for us to directly teach them different variations and the positivity, and being able to teach them ways to be anti-biased within their play. So you can get down and directly play with them to show them various different scenarios and have a more kind of balanced approach and unbiased perception, even within their imaginative play.
So, Amy, you spoke of direct instruction. There's direct instruction when socializing Black children as well, but it looks a little different. So, most Black children are socialized in our families with what Black families refer to as the talk. I know most people hear the talk and assume that we're mentioning the birds and the bees, but for Black children, that's different. The talk is unwritten rules that they're given to survive in the world, usually, especially more so for males, and it's due to the way society perceives males. I'm going to show a video. I have a video where a teenage boy actually explains the talk rules that his mother gave to him, and then I'm going to follow up with some questions after that.
Don't put your hands in your pockets. Don't put your hoodie on. Don't be outside with no shirt on. Check in with your people. It don't matter, you down the street. Don't be out too late. Don't touch anything you're not buying. Never leave the store without a receipt or a bag, even if it's just a pack of gum. Never make it look like there's an altercation between you and someone else. Never leave the house without your ID. Don't drive with a wife beat on. Don't drive with a do-rag on. Don't go out in public with neither. Don't ride with the music too loud. Don't stare at a Caucasian woman. If a cop stop you randomly and start questioning you, don't talk back. Just compromise. If you ever get pulled over, hands on the dashboard, and ask, could you get out your license and registration?
So, as you can see, these are very, very basic activities and everyday life things that most children and teenagers do. So, just imagine having to worry every time your child leaves the house that they're going to do one of these things and end up arrested or dead or judged or something like that. I just want you to think of that for a moment, because that is what most Black parents have to deal with when their child leaves the house to do something basic like go to the store. I want to share a really personal story here. If you look at this picture here, this is my son in 2014 when he was 8 years old. Looks like an innocent child to most people, to me especially, but probably to most of you too. It was at this age when I decided that my son needed the talk. It was 2014 and Tamir Rice had just been killed for playing with a toy gun, and that led me to bring my son in and start the talk with him. And the way that we did this was, first I took away all his water guns and said, you're no longer allowed to play outside with your friends with water guns, because I was afraid. Secondly, we practiced with his hands up in the air. What would you do if a police came? So for about 45 minutes straight, we practiced the scenario. Me being the police, him being the child. What do? You put your hands up. If mommy gets pulled over, you put your hands on the dashboard. And of course, he questioned why. Why do I have to do this? I mean, it became me more yelling at him and getting frustrated and saying, this is something that you have to learn. You have to learn this. And I had to explain to him, even if your white friends don't do the same thing, this is something that you have to do. If they speak up, you cannot. If they run, you cannot. You stand there with your hands up, because for you, son, it could be a matter of life and death. That night, I also went to bed and cried myself to sleep for 45 minutes, because it's not fair. It's unfair that this child, who's a piece of his innocence, had to be taken that way away that day just because of how society is going to view him when this is what he looks like.
Lisa, make sure you unmute.
I'm sorry. What I had said was, my heart breaks as I think about Cameron losing his innocence, practicing his arms up, learning about the injustice in this world at the age of 8. And this is why this work and understanding is so important. So if we take a look at our second theory, this focuses on the perspective of social cognitive development. And what we know is that in young children, prejudice arises initially from cognitive limitations. Young children are very concrete and rule-bound and have a tendency to need to create order within their thinking. And so 4-year-olds really prefer things the same, have a preference for things that are like them. By 5 to 7 years, children are even more rigid in their thinking and categorizing and sorting people into good and bad categories. And by the time that children are 8 to 10, their rigid thinking declines as they're able to think more about other people's perspectives and recognize other people have unique mental perspectives, experiences, and develop more in their theory of mind.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about who helps our children to create these rules and the order within which they start to categorize what is good or bad, or what is beautiful or what is accepted. And we really do. Anytime that you're interacting with a child, it's going to help to influence the lens in which they see this world. So the way that we frame conversations and the language that we use helps the child to be able to define these categories. But the thing that's very important that you have to understand is that we cannot separate our own biases from the language and the structure that we put around conversations. We really have to do the work to acknowledge our own biases, educate ourselves, and really examine and do the work to do better, so that these biases so that you can overcome these biases and they don't influence then the children that we're working on. I'm sure many of you have probably seen Project Implicit out of Harvard has an online bias test. The link for it's within the resource page that we're going to provide for you. There's also going to be a talk later on within the Civic Leads series discussing implicit bias further. So please look for that if you're interested. So knowing that our biases influence our language and how we speak to children, it may make you hesitant to even try. A lot of times, especially parents, they're afraid to say the wrong things, don't say anything at all. And to be totally honest, that's how I was in the first couple of years of parenthood, and even working with students. I know we have some, professors on here tonight as well. Thank you, Julie. Julie put the link to the implicit bias test into the comments for you as well. But, as we're working with our students and with children in general, it's not okay to be taught, as I was raised, to just be colorblind. We really have to be able to appreciate the differences between all of us and really work towards more, not just unbiased, but an anti-racist viewpoint. And I did say work towards, because this is a lifelong journey for the majority of us. If you are like me, you are white, grew up in a very homogeneous white community. it's a lifelong journey that we have to acknowledge, and we have to help our children to acknowledge that as well. But again, I don't want you to feel like these conversations are so hard or you're so scared to have them that you don't have them at all. So I have a couple of suggestions, really just starting small and talking about the differences between each of us, and talking about those differences in a framework of how beautiful those differences are. Acknowledging variations in hair and skin, mobility, and family structure are places that you can start. You may have a fear that a child may point out those differences when you're out in public, but having these conversations and helping to shape the lens through which they see these differences will change what they point out about it. And we'll talk about that in a second. But some different examples of how kind of conversational starters are here on this slide. I Am Enough is an amazing book, an empowering story of a Black girl. But I love the empowering story because we need to expose white children to those stories very, very importantly. But also within this book, the other characters, the other children that are illustrated within the book, all are different. There are no two that have similar characteristics, even in different modes of mobility, and they're all playing and doing different things together. So it's really a great conversational starter about the uniqueness of each and every one of us and how beautiful being unique is. All the Colors We Are takes a biological approach to explaining differences in skin color. So it talks about melanin, the pigment that works with the sun to produce this, all the shades of skin that there are, and it gives different words to those different shades. So it's not just a black and white, it talks in a really positive way about variation. Obviously, a kid's book about racism is much more direct. I would recommend, my son is 6, my daughter is 7, and I had an amazing conversation, and we continue to have these amazing conversations with this book. But it's much more direct, and it talks about what racism is, and it puts it in a kid's perspective and all different aspects that then you can grow, and conversations can go from there. You also can utilize movies and be mindful of the movies that you're watching. Smallfoot is actually a very great movie that talks about advocacy at a child's level. So using these different books and different movies can help to start conversations, and they can be premeditated conversations. So you feel a little bit more prepared to go into them. And then once you have enough of those premeditated conversations, these uncomfortable conversations start to become more comfortable. So after these conversations, if a child points out a difference in public, the child may say is going to change from "Why do you have braids in your hair?" to "Your braids are so pretty."
So as we can see from the comment from Amy about the judgment about the girl's braids, your braids are so pretty, it's important for us to understand how children make judgments and how judgments develop in children. And so what we find is that initially judgments about others are based on children's emotions at the time. And so especially fear really seems to influence the kind of judgment a child makes. Around the ages of 5 to 7, their judgments are more based on their perceptions. And so what are they seeing? What does the person look like? And here we find, again, like their thinking, their judgments tend to be fairly rigid. And once they develop in their cognitive skills after the age of 7, we find less rigidity in their thinking, and children are able to think about and classify on multiple different dimensions. And so they become less rigid and are open to the possibility of less prejudice at this time. And so an application of this, something to keep in mind, is how important it is, especially at younger ages, to provide positive exposure to different races to reduce any negative emotions and those associations. And as children get older and advance in their thinking and judgment, you can provide more exposure from a wide range of sources.
And as Lisa was saying, that positive exposure is very important, especially for Black children, because typically Black children don't see themselves as valued in society. I have another personal story I'd like to share. This here is a picture of me and my niece, and back in December, I just needed a simple pair of pantyhose. So she and I were out shopping, something we do often, and I said, oh, I was just gonna run up to CVS really quick. I need to grab some pantyhose. And I live in a mostly white community, and we ran up to CVS, and they did not have pantyhose in my color. So I said, we're gonna run over to Target. In the back of my mind, I've lived this life for 37 years. I assumed they wouldn't have it, but I also thought it's 2020, they should have them. We went over to Target. Target also did not have pantyhose in my color. So I tell my niece, who's 5, I say, we're gonna have to drive to a more urban neighborhood. And she just looks at me with a confused look. And I said, well, Auntie can't find any pantyhose near where we live in my skin color. And she says, well, why? Why can't you? And so I have to have a learning lesson for her. But then instantly, what is that doing to her? What is that telling her about her value in society, that she's not important enough? We're not important enough for the stores to carry pantyhose in our color, the stores in our own neighborhoods. We have to drive far further, even in 2020, to find that. So I ask you, do you, as a teacher or someone who's dealing with all races of children, especially brown children, do you have things that cater to them? For example, brown Band-Aids. Just as an FYI, Band-Aid just started making them in 2020, or even if you do something like teach ballet or something like that. Do your brown students actually have ballet shoes their color? Probably not, because those things don't exist. Also, hair products. Typically, you can't find the exact hair products that you need unless you drive to a more urban neighborhood. So my question that I pose is, are you making sure that Black children you are responsible for molding and teaching feel valued, because society doesn't necessarily make them feel like that? So I think there needs to be extra work to make sure that that's the case.
Yeah, and just as Michelle was saying, it's all of our responsibility to do that, but it starts with us to help shape our child's judgment of what and who should be valued, and then how exactly do we show somebody that they are valued. So, kids are sponges. They are always listening to us, especially when we're not wanting them to listen. They're listening even harder. So we really want to be mindful of the conversations that we're having with children and even to other adults around children, because they are going to take in. We need to model the language that we want them to be using. So you really should be mindful of, are you using an asset-based approach to describing different things, or are you using a deficit-based approach in your descriptions? If you're talking about a community, are you talking about the needs of a community? Or are you talking about the opportunities and the talents within that community? And especially with current events that are happening now, there's a lot that children are going to be seeing on the news. And perceptions of media, what your perception may be, they're seeing a lot of one side of things in some instances. Are you talking about these protests as gatherings of people during a pandemic, when we've told our children we can't gather in group? And they're also seeing the violence involved in some of these, if they're watching news at all. Or are we framing protests as being a collective group of people working together so that their voices are heard after a more quiet attempt wasn't acknowledged? I'll give you an example of then, bringing that even further down to their level of, I explain the protest to my children like this. So think about if you were on a playground. It's very busy, kids running around, talking, yelling, and you want to get Mrs. Smith's attention. You have something really important you have to tell her. If you, as one child, said, Mrs. Smith, do you think she would hear you? Possibly not. But if you and all of your classmates of 30 children came together and said, Mrs. Smith, then she would be able to hear you and you could have that important conversation. So it's really important to model that appropriate language and that language that shows value to various different communities, but it's also important to bring that explanation down to how a child can understand it. So that's, kind of talking in the way that we talk about things, and we talked about implicit biases, but we really need to be actively teaching our children to be specifically anti-racist. It's not enough to just teach them to be unbiased. The system of oppression wasn't created by the people that it oppresses. We need to take that responsibility to teach our children to support and empower their friends and neighbors who are Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, and people of color to ensure equitable access to resources like Band-Aids and like appropriate Band-Aids and hose, as well as opportunities within their schools and around our community. So as a child gets older, we've talked about starting, teaching these different concepts through more structured, premeditated conversations. But as a child gets older, their judgment changes to this multi-dimensional kind of framework. And so you really need to apply it to the instances and the experiences that they are having within their everyday life. So as your child gets older, they're going to be talking about conversations they've had at school, things that have happened at school, and you really need to pay attention to these and take those opportunities to be able to, again, kind of mold and shape their lens to be able to look at multiple factors within the situation they found themselves in. One of my friends, Mary Gavi, and I were talking about this, and she's doing a lot of great work in the same arena, and she was telling me a story about her daughter. Her daughter was in middle school, and she came home upset one day. And she had a classmate who was just very disruptive to the point where she had made her teacher cry. She didn't follow the rules. Her daughter is very much a rule follower, and she's very kind-hearted. And this child really upset her because she just continually, day after day, was very disruptive within the classroom and acted out. This classmate of hers was also Black and spoke African American English. And so her daughter said to her, all people who speak this way are troublemakers. So my friend had a couple of options of how she could react to this. She said, oh, not all children that speak that way act like that, and left it like that. And, that's one option. She chose to dig in. She really dug in and chose to have a really real conversation about the fact that her skin color or the way that she talks had nothing to do with the behavior that she was exhibiting. And as a speech therapist, we would call it behavioral analysis. She talked to her about how behaviors manifest, and that sometimes it stems from other factors of maybe not feeling supported or feeling included. And she encouraged her daughter to sit down and have a conversation with this classmate. And she did. She sat down with her at lunch. She got to know her a little bit better. And honestly, she got ridiculed for it because nobody else was friends with this girl. But her daughter reached out. She lost some over it. She took the brave route that even it's hard for adults to take sometimes, of really digging in and reaching out and getting to know a person for who they are rather than the assumptions and the biases that we see. So I would really, kind of fast forward is they became friends. And my friend's daughter came home and, later on in the school year and just said, I'm really proud of her. She's her classmate. She's like, she's doing better. And this friendship has actually led to this classmate feeling much more supported and being able to confide in my friend's daughter and some pretty tricky things that she experienced later on in the year. So I would like to encourage you to also choose these difficult conversations. Like I said before, if you start with the smaller conversations when they're little, these more difficult conversations will come a little bit more easily. But these conversations, the challenging the biases even within our children, are the way to truly change the lens of our children and to help our children be open to changing that lens throughout their lifetime, we as adults need to learn that lesson sometimes of it's okay to learn something new and then do better because of it. So for anything to change, though, we really have to get comfortable with having these uncomfortable conversations.
So what do you think the impact is not having Band-Aids in your collar or pantyhose available that match you? Think about what Amy just said about challenging bias. And these lead directly to our next theory, which is social identity theory. This theory really explains why we see an increase in prejudice in middle childhood and adolescence, even though the children at this age have increased cognitive skills. What we find is that children are motivated to judge their own groups favorably, and they do this in order to feel better about themselves and develop a positive social identity. And you can see on the slides the stages of developing ethnic awareness and attitudes. And it's really not until the age of 3 and up where we see an ethnic preference where children want to view their own group more positively and are really, it sets the stage for development of prejudice. And what we find is that we tend to seek out information that confirms our own group bias. And so if we think that we're best, we find information that confirms that. And one of the things that people can do is to work with children to try to evoke a common group identity that goes above and beyond race. One of the classic studies that really helps us understand this social identity theory was done in 1970 by a 3rd grade teacher, a woman by the name of Jane Elliott. And it is the classic brown-eyed, blue-eyed study where she took a 2-day period and she did an experiment in her classroom where children were privileged either if they had blue eyes on the first day or brown eyes on the second day. And we're going to watch a little bit of the video. The whole video is available in top documentaries. So if you have an interest, you can go ahead and watch more of it. But we're just going to watch a few minutes where you can see actual video footage of the children experiencing this privilege or lack of privilege. And there's a little brief clip in there where you'll see the children as adults because they came back to then watch this video. But let's take a minute and watch a few minutes of this.
United States, we do not treat as our brothers.
Yeah.
Who?
Yeah.
The black people. Who else? Absolutely, the Indians. And when you see, when many people see a black person or a yellow person or a red person, what do they think?
Look at that. Dumb people.
And look at the dumb people. What else do they think sometimes? What kinds of things do they say about black people?
They're niggers.
In the city, many places in the United States, how are black people treated? How are Indians treated? How are people who are of a different color than we are treated?
They're part of this world. They don't get anything in this world.
Why is that?
Because they're different colors.
You think you know how that would feel to be judged by the color of your skin?
Yeah.
Do you think you do? No, I don't think you would know how that felt unless you had been through it, would you? It might be interesting to judge people today by the color of their eyes. Would you like to try this?
Yeah!
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Since I'm the teacher and I have blue eyes, I think maybe the blue-eyed people should be on top the first day.
Up here?
I mean, the blue-eyed people are the better people in this room. Oh, yes, they are. Blue-eyed people are smarter than brown-eyed people.
My dad isn't that stupid.
Is your dad brown-eyed?
Yeah.
One day you came to school and you told us that he kicked you.
He did.
Do you think a blue-eyed father would kick his son?
Yeah. My
dad's blue-eyed. He's never kicked me. Greg's dad is blue-eyed. He's never kicked him. But Rex's dad is blue-eyed. He's never kicked him. This is a fact. Blue-eyed people are better than brown-eyed people. Are you brown-eyed or blue-eyed?
Blue.
Why are you shaking your head? Are you sure that you're right? Why? What makes you so sure that you're right?
I don't know.
The blue-eyed people get 5 extra minutes of recess, while the brown-eyed people have to stay in. The brown-eyed people do not get to use the drinking fountain. You'll have to use the paper cups. You brown-eyed people are not to play with the blue-eyed people on the playground because you are not as good as blue-eyed people. Well, the brown-eyed people in this room today are going to wear collars so that we can tell from a distance what color your eyes are. On page 127. 127. Is everyone ready? Everyone but Laurie. Ready, Laurie?
Brown-eyed.
She's a brown-eyed. You'll begin to notice today that we spend a great deal of time waiting for brown-eyed people. The yardstick's gone. Well, okay. I don't see the yardstick. Do you?
It's coming over there. Hey, Miss Lake, you better keep that on your desk so if the brown-eyed people get out of hand.
Oh, you think if the brown-eyed people get out of hand, that would be the thing to use? Who goes first to lunch?
Blue-eyed.
The blue-eyed people. No brown-eyed people go back for seconds. Blue-eyed people may go back for seconds. Brown-eyed people do not.
Brown-eyed.
Don't you know?
Oh, they're not smart.
Is that the only reason?
They'll take too much.
It might take too much.
They-
Okay, quietly.
And it seemed like when we were down on the bottom, everything bad was happening to us. The way they treated you, you felt like you didn't even want to try to do anything. It seemed like Mrs. Elliott was taking our best friends away from us.
What happened at recess? Were 2 of you boys fighting?
Yeah, Russell and John were.
What happened, John?
Russell called me names and I hit him in the gut.
What did he
Brown eyes.
You call him brown eyes?
They always call us that. Greg and all of the boys call us brown eyes. They said, come here, brown eyes. And they were calling us blue eyes. I wasn't. Sandy and Donna were. Yeah.
What's wrong with being called brown eyes?
It means that we're stupider. Well, not that. But, oh, that's just the same way as other people calling black people niggers. Yeah.
Is that the reason you hit him, John? Did it help? Did it stop him? Did it make you feel better inside?
Stop Russell.
Make you feel better inside? It make you feel better to call him brown eyes? Why do you suppose you call him brown eyes?
Right, because he has brown eyes.
Is that the only reason? He didn't call him brown eyes yesterday and he had brown eyes yesterday. Didn't he?
Because we get started. Yeah, you put those blue rings on there.
So take a minute and think about what conclusions you can make from this experience about your own group bias or the own group bias that was shown by children and how that would impact their self-esteem and their development of prejudice.
video is just so impactful. So you can see within that video and within that experiment just how important it is when we are the teachers, the coaches, counselors, anybody that's leading a group of children, to be able to kind of ensure that developing your in and your out group are developing your whole group as the in group, a more subordinate or superordinate group that is working towards a common goal rather than individual groups that are kind of segmented by physical attributes. So how do we shift group identity from physical characteristics like eye and skin to more superordinate characteristics like a sports group to be able to achieve that group's goal? We need to stop seeing the out group as all being one entity. We need to be able to get to know them as individuals and realize that we have similarities with each other, but the only way that we are going to be able to get to understand other groups of people, other cultures, other races, is to be able to provide our children more exposure, to be able to create opportunities for our children to develop genuine relationships with their peers and mentors who identify as a culture other than their own. This allows the children to understand and to learn that within a group that looks similar, each member of that group is truly unique. And like I said, they're able to find those commonalities. But this can only happen with opportunities to build those genuine relationships. I don't feel like this can be taught directly. You can't learn about other individuals by somebody else teaching you. You really have to have those experiences. It's just like if you were going to go on a study abroad trip, or if you were going to go to a different country, go to a different culture. You can read books, you can be taught by a professor or a teacher, all the different characteristics, the demographics, the language, and you might think that you know that culture, but until you go and you're truly interacting with people from that other culture, you don't understand the uniqueness and the beauty that lies within. And I feel like this, providing these opportunities for exposure really helps to grow that appreciation for various groups that are different from your own, that you don't identify with. So I want to be very, very clear about my intention behind this, though. This is not to insert ourselves as white people into a Black community to be taught by them. It is not to kind of put more pressure or to lean on them to teach us. It is truly, and I'm very intentional with using genuine relationships when I talk about this, but it's truly just to provide more opportunities for our children to develop those truly genuine relationships with children from other cultures. So I definitely want to make that clear kind of with this, but I do think it is very important to be able to have, for our children to have role models from other cultures, other groups, to be able to really appreciate the beauty within those differences. So we can do this in a couple of different ways. We can intentionally, if you're looking for a place to settle down with your family, you can choose your neighborhoods very intentionally, your schools, making sure that diversity is truly there, to have better opportunities to develop those genuine relationships. But if you're already solidified somewhere within a community that is very majority white, then you have to work harder to be able to reach outside of your immediate community for your children's extracurricular activities, their sports, their music, whatever you may have them in. You have to work harder to be able to seek out other opportunities for your children to develop friendships and to see and have role models from different cultures other than your own. So I really think that you can change the perspective of in and out groups being characterized as your, purely from physical characteristics of that group, and realigning that social identity of a group to more superordinate group of your classroom or your sports team.
So just reiterating more with Amy talking about exposure, I just can't overstate the importance of exposing your children to race at a young age in a positive way. I think for most Black families, I know for my parents, then also for my son, we have to do this just so that we see ourselves. I mean, instead of choosing plays always at Playhouse Square, we choose plays at a Karamu house. Karamu is the oldest African American theater in the U.S., and we're lucky it happens to be local. We also, books. Amy pointed out the books. We intentionally choose books with characters as that look like us. I know growing up and then even also raising my son, we drove 45 minutes to find a church that had more diversity. We joined YMCAs and groups such as Jack and Jill, which is a group that develop African American leaders so that we had more diversity. But what I noticed growing up, and still sometimes what I notice, is I don't necessarily see my white friends doing the same thing with their children. And growing up, I remember I didn't see their parents doing that. So my challenge to you is, take your child to a play at a Karamu house where they're going to have an all-Black cast, or where they're going to hear a story that has to do with something that has to do with Black people, because typically they're not learning that in school. Most history that they're learning has been whitewashed. But take your kids to a YMCA that has more diversity, or find diverse play groups so that your children are exposed to positive Black role models.
So given Michelle's comments about the neighborhood, the environment, and the culture, this leads us to our final theory, which is developmental intergroup theory. And from this perspective, it recognizes the importance of the cognitive limitations as well as the intergroup relations aspects from social identity theory, and then adds the idea that prejudice is shaped by the nature of the experiences that you have within your culture. And so children are actively constructing meaning from their experiences and the environment in which these experiences are occurring, and these are then reflected in their intergroup attitudes. And here again, we can go back to one of those classic studies. But before we do that, just keep in mind, we are biologically pre-wired to recognize differences. And determining what differences we recognize, these are the ones that are psychologically salient. And in our culture, race happens to be one of those. And then we categorize individuals based on those dimensions. So that's the second step in this process. And adults frequently are giving the children the labels for the various different groups that they're categorizing. And then based on this, we find the development of stereotypes, prejudice, and then these stereotypes are used to fill kinds of information and how it gets interpreted. And so we go back here to the classic doll study, which you may or may not be familiar with. But the original doll study was conducted in 1947 by Kenneth and Mamie Clark. And what they found was when they studied Black children, there was a preference among these children, you can see in the picture in the upper right-hand corner, to play with the white dolls and to label the white dolls with positive characteristics. That was a nice doll. That was the doll that had nice color. And the Black doll was the one that looked bad. And this study really was integral in the famous Brown versus Board of Education case that led to school desegregation, as we found that schools were not separate and equal. And so you might think, oh, well, we've come so far since 1947, right? Well, we'd like to that, but in 2010, CNN actually commissioned famous psychologist, Dr. Margaret Beale Spencer, to complete a new doll study. And this study was done with both white and Black children of two different age groups, different geographic regions. And there's a video clip that's embedded in the slides. We're not going to show it because of the timing, but that is there for you if you'd like to go back and take a look at it. And then I have another video clip that we'll put in the additional resources. But these videos show you the results, which were hauntingly similar to what Kenneth and Mamie Clark found, in that the darker skin tones were associated with negative ratings. That was the bad child. That was the child that nobody likes. That was the child that gets in trouble, whereas the lighter skin tones were associated with the positive characteristics, the nice child, the one that teachers like, and so forth.
And so the way that the doll study plays out in Black, especially, it seems to be more younger Black females, it plays out as almost a self-hatred thing, because society does tend to appreciate European aesthetics more. So what I did is I just spoke to some very important people in my life. I'm going to quickly read these 5 statements due to time, but I don't like my hair. I wish it was straight and pretty. Addie, currently age 6. I wish my skin was lighter and prettier. Michelle, currently age 37. I wish my lips weren't so big and ugly. Allie, currently age 23. I wish my nose wasn't so wide. Katie, currently age 96. I wish my behind and legs were smaller so I was prettier. Ani, age 66. I think the thing that stands out to me the most here is you have a 96-year-old and a 6-year-old who both felt the same way. So this has been going on for 90 years. I mean, longer, obviously, but, just in my own little personal study. So it just tells me, you guys, we've just got work to do. We just have work to do so that little Black girls don't grow up feeling this way.
So just some quick takeaways that we each have for you from the presentation. I want you to remember that we are all responsible for socializing the children that we encounter, whether it's in our personal lives or in our work lives. And we have to take into account their developmental level, their thinking, their judgment, their social cognition, and we have to provide them with developmentally appropriate experiences and examples to counter the racist messages that they get in our culture.
And we really have to acknowledge our own biases to be able to work and change your perspective, because your lens is going to influence the development of their lens. And having those hard conversations early and often will then make those more difficult, more uncomfortable conversations become more comfortable. And always remember that you are not alone. Reach out to others that are doing this similar work for support and resources.
And then recognize your racial bias and take an active approach to try to view life from the perspective of the Black children in your life. Just also want to point out, just because you don't see racism in your everyday life does not mean it does not exist. And I'm really excited to see the current changes, but even with those, there's still a long way to go, and this needs to be long-lasting, not a trend, so that we can fully tear down the racist and oppressive systems that have been present for so long.
And so we're going to go ahead and leave these final thoughts up here. This is an excerpt from an article from a writer and podcaster who's also a father that really sums up much of what we just reviewed. And so we're just going to leave this on the screen while we open it up for questions.
And you can type your questions into the chat box if you'd like, and we can go that way. Lisa and team, we have a question. Did you see it there?
Thank you. Yeah, I see a question from Daniel on how do we work to amend our faulty and racist textbooks in public schools. For those of you that are going to be educators, you may have some say in which textbooks are selected in your school district. You can run for school board, you can get involved, you can write a textbook, so many different ways that you personally, every person can get involved at addressing the information that is given to our students in the textbooks. And I would also just add, and then I'll let Amy and Michelle contribute their comments, but I would also add that as parents, you can supplement the kinds of information that you provide to your children that goes beyond their textbook, both in terms of the kinds of trips that you take, the books that you have, and all the other things that everybody's talked about so far today.
Yeah, I would also, I agree with the fact of kind of if you have say in choosing textbooks, but also there's a lot of great supplemental resources that you can use outside and in addition to your textbooks as well. So I would absolutely recommend going above and beyond, because if it's systems that are similar to what I grew up with, it was very, very whitewashed. So looking beyond the resources that are provided to you to be able to provide a more kind of well-rounded history.
I agree with what both of them said. I think, for one, choosing the textbooks, I personally don't have much hope that even choosing textbooks, though, that you're going to find true Black history in them. So I think if you want it to be taught in your classrooms as much as you can, you're going to have to supplement. But also, as we've said, don't be afraid to ask. I would have loved for my son's teachers to have said, what can I teach? What is something that you know of that I can bring into this classroom? So don't be afraid to ask. Most of us do not mind sharing, so that history is part of our child's history in school also.
Jill has a great comment about the double jeopardy of biases of social class and race, which are absolutely there. And we discussed including that, but we for time's sake, there's not enough time to truly include that as well. But that's absolutely completely valid and present.
I do apologize for taking so long and going late and not leaving very much time for questions. And I imagine that you all have things that you need to get to, but I know that we are all open to answering questions. If you want to send us an email, seek us out at any point. Amy and I both teach at BW, and Michelle, if you have questions specifically for Michelle, I can certainly forward them directly to her, if that's okay with her.
Thank you to all of our presenters. Wonderful presentation. I know as a parent, I learned a lot. For others, just want to mention to our audience, thanks to you as well, but our upcoming presentations are listed on the screen. These are our next 3, and there's more to follow. And as Christy said, we are looking for topics and ideas and speakers for our fall series. So please don't hesitate to send those our way. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.